Hello, everybody. This is Mary. I'm Mary Ellen Slayter, and I am the CEO and founder of RepCap, a content marketing agency that works primarily with HR tech companies. But also, I've been a journalist covering HR and the future of work now, I think I'd say for about 20 years. And I am very excited about this conversation here. We have one of those moments where we get to pull together a CEO and a CHRO to talk about one of the topics that I think is causing a lot of concern and still a lot of stress for a lot of our HR leaders in particular, and also our business leaders. And so, first up, I've got Karim Nehdi, is the CEO of Herrmann. Those of you who may know more like whole brain thinking, the company behind that. And he's been working as an executive himself, for more than 20 years, working in innovation, technology, team development, all of these pieces. So, one, he gets to bring in his perspective both as a leader, but also as someone who has collaborated with other global leaders and kind of the CEO perspective on this. And then I've also got Franny. Franny is the founder of Interrobang HR. But before she started and went out as a fractional HR leader, Franny has worked on a number of within a number of organizations where navigating major changes. So she's the CHRO that you bring in when you have an M&A, when you're scaling up really rapidly, when you're in a moment of crisis. And she's worked in healthcare, manufacturing, and consulting. So I want to thank you both for taking the time to do this. I think this is going to be a good conversation.
It's great to be here, Mary Ellen and Franny. I think some companies may be feeling that moment of crisis that relates to return to work, right? Return to office.
Right?
I expect so. Yes.
Right. And so what are we going to talk about today? So specifically looking at return to work, we are going to talk about the challenges of this. I think again, this is something coming out of the pandemic. There used to be you worked at home or you worked in an office, and that was that. And now we sometimes work at home, we sometimes work in offices. Some people get to work in certain, environment. It's really become a complex set of decisions. And I think that's created some challenges specifically for the way that we think of ourselves as teams doing work together. And I think in the past, we have assumed that, if you worked with somebody before and you were in an office and then you went remote, we all knew that when we all went remote, that required special attention, that required making sure that we could reform those norms, that we could figure out how to collaborate. And I think one of the interesting things that's happened is that during the return to work stuff, it's almost like we forgot we're not the same people that we were when we left. And I think that is one of the things that this is creating some new challenges. We're going to talk about those challenges. We're going to talk about how to understand your employee needs. So, a lot of times you're like, hey, come back to the office. It's not that simple. And people's needs are different. Some people can't wait to get back to the office. Some people are like, oh my God, I'll have to redesign my entire life in order to accommodate this. And they're just looking for another job immediately. And then hybrid creates its own challenges. So we're going to explore like some of those needs. And then last but not least, again, going back to that team thing, we do our work in teams. We don't work alone, for most complex projects today, especially that's just not the reality of our work. And we're going to talk to these two about some actionable things that we can do to actually make those dynamics healthy. So being intentional, bringing people back together, what can we do to make sure that we're building trust, that we're fostering collaboration? I think there's a lot to dig in here. And I think the first thing that I want to do is actually, I want to know what is your working environment right now? We got a quick poll. It would help us to know, are you already back? Well, everybody's in the office. Are you hybrid? Like, what's your situation? Right. Let's see our results. Oh, so we've still got lots of fully remote people. We don't have anybody here that says they're all back in the office. We got lots of hybrid. So hybrid's number one. And then my other, it's like, who was my other over here? It's like, what was in terms of looking at those comments? Two people who said they're doing something else. All right. So I'm interested in this conversation. While this isn't explicitly about whole brain thinking and like Herrmann and HBDI, I do think it is useful to think about the ways that whole brain thinking can help us answer some of these questions. So we may touch on that in bits and pieces as we're walking through our questions. So let's jump on in and talk about the challenges. That's where I'm going to start here. I'm going to start with you, Franny. Like, what what are you hearing right now? Like, what is the biggest challenge as companies bringing people back to the work? What are they running into?
So people are running into resistance. Obviously, leaders are running into resistance from employees. leaders are running into their own resistance as well. They may have a setup that works well for them to work from home, and coming back into the office may mean sacrifices for their own families. The second thing I'm hearing a lot about is just general confusion. People don't understand why they need to come into the office. They don't understand what the purpose is. They find themselves coming into an office, sitting in a cubicle on a Zoom with other people and not necessarily getting anything out of the interaction themselves in the office. There's confusion about what platforms and tools to use, confusion about what norms there should be. Um, and I'm not sure that people have sat down to explicitly derive value around in office days versus at home days and agree on norms. And I don't think that people have recreated the workplace in a way that truly embraces this new future of work and embraces the needs and desires and motivators of the people who they're currently working with.
Yeah, that's so true, Franny. I mean, and there's so many blind spots or kind of watch outs that I think at the leadership level, what you've touched on it, but so much that you see a lot of surveys. I think McKinsey published one not long ago, that the very strong preferences for working from home are often at the most senior levels of the organization, and yet they're also the ones who are kind of most vocal, saying, "Got to get back into the office, got to get back into the office, got to get back into the office." And so there's kind of a bit of dissonance there that we have to reconcile. And leaders themselves, I think of one CEO that I've talked to about this quite a bit, and he, right before the pandemic, splashed out for some pretty swanky offices in Manhattan, and that was maybe a couple of months prior to the pandemic taking shape, and then 5 years later is struggling to get people to come into these glorious temples of collaboration and innovation that he had his really set his mind around, and is really struggling to overcome that sort of fixed mindset that he had around what work was or what work should be for the organization that he led and for the culture he was trying to build. And all that said, despite all that, he loves working from home. And most of the calls that I do with him, he's sitting in his home office, right? So it's this funny sort of duality that I think a lot of leaders are really struggling with. And I sense it. And one of the fun dynamics here that Mary Ellen mentioned is that we've got a CEO and a CHRO, and on this webinar. But I see a lot of tension between CEOs and HR leaders around how to make this work, right? CEOs are still pushing it so hard. We got to get people back into the office. We got to get people back in the office. A lot of the HR and talent leaders that I talk to are frankly kind of tired of talking about it, right? It's been a year and they've been trying to do so much to get people back into the office, and it's coming up short because the reality is, I think most people prefer some sort of hybrid setup, right? And to your point, Franny, getting the right structure in place to support that seems to be a big part of the challenge here.
Okay, we've got some research from Gallup on this. Actually, let's kind of pull up this chart here right quick. So Grace is our producer. So if I ask, okay, come on, Grace, let's see our chart. Let's see our chart. I think this is where some of the resistance comes into, right? So when we ask people, like Gallup asks people, if your job is capable of being remote. So one, I think it's important to always acknowledge that not all jobs can be performed remotely. So setting aside that, and we just ask the people who can, and over half of the people who can, they actually say they expect and prefer to work hybrid. And hybrid, to me, hybrid is the hardest way, right? It's like when then you have to start building in some really complex systems where you're not overweighting people just because they're near you. But like this, and the people who you really want to have stay, these are often they've got bargaining power. You have to decide, like, how hard are you going to push this, right? You have to, and what we're finding is that not very hard. Like people, they'll talk tough, but when the end, if like your whole sales team comes up and says no, like your top performers, then you realize, like, okay, well, y'all are fired. Now I'll go find some. Most people don't have the stomach for that. They don't feel that strongly about it. But I also like these numbers, I think are pretty clear. These expectations aren't, look at this. It's not even long-term location, what they have right now. It's like future preferences, future
Mm-hmm.
preferences. It goes up even higher.
Mm-hmm.
So the higher up you are, the more likely you want this. And like, what you gonna do? What
And
There
to
was an
Kareem's
interesting,
point, it's the most expensive way to work as well, right? Because you have to pay for the real estate, and it's the most complex way to try to figure out how and when to bring people in. It takes the most resources to arrange everyone, and this is how we're going to be working. So this is real, and this is how we're going to be working. Kareem, go
it's
right
the
ahead.
least flexible, to put it another way,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Mhm.
every survey I see, frankly, every conversation that I have with our own internal talent and with talent leaders, flexibility is the number one driver, number one motivator for so much talent out there right now, more than comp, more than other aspects or other benefits. There's a
Mhm.
really interesting question that came up in the chat around why are execs pushing so hard, right? And I think that's a great question. I mean, I think there are good reasons and there are not so good reasons, right? The good
Real estate
reasons,
sunk cost, bad reason.
yeah, sunk cost fallacy is definitely not a good reason, right?
Right.
The good reasons, because I'll speak to these personally, right? We've been fully remote as a company since 2017, and I found myself longing for in-person interactions more than ever, really, in the past year or so. And I think there are magical moments that come in person, right? And especially in increasingly volatile times, increasingly volatile markets, right? The speed of that things can get done when you're in an in-person environment, the speed of knowledge transfer, the speed of learning, right? All of those are really material benefits of co-location, right? So there are definitely redeeming aspects, and I think everyone can speak to that. So I think a lot of CEOs are looking for that. It's almost a manifestation of these incredibly fast moving and challenging times that we're operating in, that it seems like it's so hard to keep up, that every bit of in-person acceleration that you can get, you want, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a good reason. It may not be feasible, but it's a good reason to want people back into the office. And that's, the argument for doing hybrid right, is to try and make the most of those kind of magic in-person moments, while recognizing that there's probably a point of we've hit and gone past the point of no return in terms of the flexibility that we offer, and the need for sort of hybrid structures to make that work. Now, some of the bad reasons, I know, Freddie, I talked a little bit about some of the bad reasons and what people were, other
Bad
reasons CEOs
reason.
might be trying to make it work. Yeah.
What's a bad reason? Give me. I was like, Brandon, give me three bad reasons to make everybody come back to the office.
Well, I would say C-suite members oftentimes have varying levels of self-awareness, just like the rest of us do. And so, so some of the reasons that I've seen that are not very convincing, and I'm sure each of you is on this call because you have heard some of these reasons that are not very convincing, are because I said so, because this is how we work, and we just need to get back to the way things we work. This is how we work. And a third really bad reason might just be because I'm going to outsource your job if you don't come into the office. But I do feel like we do need to directly address that there is an implied threat to return to office that is very real for many employees and frankly for many leaders, which is if you don't have a relationship, if you don't have uh, a community of care with your coworkers, it's easier for them to think about you as a commodity. So sometimes I think CEOs are under so much pressure that they forget that their employees are highly valuable here in the US, doing their work with them as a collaboration point, and um, they may believe a reason to quote unquote return to office that is because they want to see you. On a very practical level, as an employee, I would take that seriously. Unfortunately, that's the reality that we live in.
Yeah, there's another thing that this oddly enough just occurred to me in this conversation, and I don't know why the two of you describing this put some dots together for me. I think a lot of times the workers, right? We think it's sometimes I think of like working offsite and the flexibility. I mean, it's a real problem, but is it the right solution? Right? Especially when we start talking about some of the needs, we get into the employee needs bit.
Mm-hmm.
Senior, more experienced people love this because then they say they're more productive. The very junior people, like we talked about that knowledge transfer bit and that
Mm-hmm.
opportunity to see and witness that collaboration. I think that the more senior people, I just had my moment here was like, yes, I believe you, more senior person, are more productive offsite than you are here, but your productivity is coming at a
Right.
cost of the opportunity for knowledge transfer for future investment. So I think it's like, I think you just kind of
Yeah.
gave me a moment of like, oh yeah, you are
Yeah.
more productive,
There
but
are
you
a lot
actually
of,
what you're borrowing from the future. You got to get
yeah.
intentional about this because I think the people who really suffer in this are Grace, our producer, one of the things she brought up when she was working this, she's a pandemic grad. She's never
Mm-hmm.
worked in an office.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
hard to teach, the young grads, like we got to teach them all this stuff and we don't think about all this, but it's like I just had this moment of like, yeah, my increased productivity comes at the expense of the wasted time talking to
Yeah.
people.
So
Like,
yes,
sorry, I just
Forbes
had a
just
moment.
said that 70 that apparently people who work in the office spend more than an hour a day not working. But what they're doing when they're not working is they're socializing and connecting with each other.
Right.
So there is value to that. There is value to that mentorship. There is value to that liminal learning. There are lots of good reasons to ask people to return to the office. I'm not sure that they are well articulated, and I'm sure that they are not well managed. People are not actively managing towards what works about working in the office. They're just trying to get things to go back to the way they were, which is not helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Kareem, what's a bad reason and what's a good reason?
Well, I mean, to go back into office, I think a good reason is, I mean, there are, and we've touched on it, lots of productivity benefits if you can strategically kind of identify the moments where it's valuable to be in person, right? And again, I'm kind of making the assumption to some degree that there's always going to be a degree of flexibility that probably didn't exist in most organizations pre-pandemic, right? But assuming that you're going to offer some sort of flexible working or hybrid arrangement, in that case, the moments to bring people back into the office are the ones where there's really a lot of upside on collaboration, right? And there's really a lot of opportunity to kind of get it right. The bad reasons, I mean, I think we've gone through a litany of them.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mhm.
I'd say honestly, the biggest one I see, and someone alluded to it in the comments, Nick did. There's still unfortunately this prevailing mindset of leadership or management that like if I can't see you, you must not be working. Or put another way, the management style of leadership by walking around, and that I think that era has passed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the challenges a bit. Like, and again, I want to know what y'all say are the challenges. But let's go with the next poll. I'd be very curious to see what y'all are encountering right now. It's the hardest, the part, what's making this hard? Because I see a few comments already over here, but I want to just give right a chance to, as we're coming back in, is it about, because a lot of times people say productivity is, oh, I'm just as productive as I was before. Is it about coordinating with people? Is it about the relationships? Like, what's making it hard? Why can't you, why do you in your organization feel like you can't do it? So give everybody a chance to weigh in. My sense is one of the biggest things is, we built structures and people built their lives around a certain rhythm of being at home and being able to run over and pick your kid up. They built a rhythm around, I gotta get this package. I mean, it requires a lot more logistics changes. I think people really got into some rhythms, and in some cases, it's a lot to ask people to change that. Like, I think it's tough. And I think people also move. They made choices about where they live. They moved further out than they would have. So taking a look at this, what are our big challenges? Consistent quality came up, but not the highest, right? The highest one is adapting to a more flexible and dynamic work environment. And then after that, communication relationships and then coordinating the schedules. The hybrid thing, I think the schedule becomes a really important piece because if you go to the office, is there anything more depressing than being told you have to come back to the office, getting to the office and getting on a Zoom call with the person who told you you had to go to the office? Oh no. Oh no, no. I mean, people, that's a
Yeah.
kind of a running joke, like online. It's like they made me come here, but nobody's here. Like,
Mhm.
so I guess thoughts about this. Kareem, why don't you, what do you think when you see this? What does this tell you?
I think it's not surprising. And so the adapting to a more flexible and dynamic work environment. I mean, I think what I've seen work well in making that change and addressing that challenge has been kind of hitting the reset button on the team, right?
Mm,
And saying, okay, look, this is a new way of working. The old approaches that may have worked either when we were fully remote or even rewinding further when we were all in the office, aren't fit for purpose anymore. And so how do you reset as a team and start from scratch? If you think about that sort of, forming, norming, the various ways of looking at the team life cycle, starting over a little bit and saying, okay, what do we need to do, first of all, to align, right? As a team. Then how do we start to accelerate and adapt, and doing things like clarifying your goals, reestablishing norms, Franny, as you mentioned earlier, developing, just understanding who's on the team, and the strengths and superpowers of each team member, right? And how those might be able to be harnessed in new ways, because of or in a new work setting, whether it be hybrid or otherwise. How do you kind of bring all those things to bear? So just sort of stopping and the stop and think moment to say, okay,
mhm.
we as a team need to think about the way that we work differently. So many teams just don't take that moment to reevaluate, right? And
Mhm.
that's a huge piece of it. The other challenge that was mentioned around communications, I mean, yeah, communication breakdowns are a huge part of the challenge that I observe every day, right? Hybrid work has kind of at the same time reduced the number of spontaneous interactions that kind of create that osmosis learning, that sort of that knowledge transfer, and overwhelmed us with and incessant notifications, and sort
So
of,
many.
yeah, and just the number of meetings that people have increased substantially. um so that ability to maintain team cohesion in that environment is much more challenging. And so, the way I look at it is bringing teams back to the office is like tuning an orchestra after months of being apart, right?
Hmm.
Without
Fit
clear
it.
communication, we're all just making noise, right? So there's that process of kind of retuning the communication so that it works for the environment.
Mm.
Yeah, that is really good, Kareem. I like that
Actually, I love that
metaphor, Kareem.
example.
Hmm.
I would also just say, so Kareem, one of the things I thought that sort of jumped out at me as you were describing this is like, if I look at this from the whole brain thinking lens, I'm a little surprised that the big failure, like there is at the mind, is actually in the yellow and in the why. It is the why. Because why do people, what is the resistance? Well, you haven't told me why. Like we have made plans, like we make, oh, people do return to office plans. And it's like, I think we cover the green. And if you want to give a quick overview of what we mean by that, but like we
Sure.
cover the green, I think very well. I think people do the data and they're like, yeah, and we'll save this much. We have this real estate. I see a massive failure, like in the why and in the why and the who, like in the yellow and the red. It's like I think they're failing. I don't know. I mean, if you agree with that, if you want to give a quick overview of why we're saying that, like to my non whole brain thinking, non
Sure,
HBD
sure.
audience
For
here.
those who aren't familiar with the whole brain model or the HBDI, that's a big part of what we do at Herrmann is we help people understand different ways of thinking, and we use four primary scales: analytical thought, which is sort of quantitative reasoning in nature; practical, temporal, sequential, sort of safekeeping thought is the second one. We refer to that as green. The analytical is the blue or the A quadrant. The practical, safekeeping is the green or the B quadrant. Relational interpersonal thinking is the C quadrant or the red, and the D quadrant, yellow, is experimental thought. So big picture, holistic thinking. And really just the approach that we take, the whole brain metaphor or the whole brain framework really looks at how those different ways of thinking impact an individual, impact an interaction, impact a team, and then ultimately impact an organization and their culture overall, right? So as we look at something like a challenge in communication breakdowns, for example, right? The whole brain perspective would say, okay, from the analytical standpoint, what are some of the factors that are really causing this communication breakdown, and how might we use data about where the communication is breaking down, or different technologies to improve the effectiveness of that communication. The practical B quadrant green view of it would be what processes, rhythms, what's the drum beat to maintain our communication flow? What do we need to do in terms of establishing that structure, that foundation, to make sure that the communication is happening as it needs to? The relational C quadrant per component, it would really look at, okay, how do we foster connections, right? How do we create spaces for example, those informal interactions, even if you're in a hybrid setting, right? How do we continue to build trust when you don't necessarily have that cracking a joke over, the proverbial water cooler moments, right? And the experimental yellow D quadrant would be looking at, okay, well, how do we really effectively help people understand the why? How do we innovate, perhaps come up with new ways of communicating to simulate, in-person spontaneity or some of the other types of communication that we may be really lacking?
Mhm.
Yeah, I think it just jumped out like how much we've really not told people. I feel we haven't covered these things, right? I think oftentimes I've seen return to office plans, and I think they are made by blue-green people for other blue-green people. Is the way I look at most of them. They're great on the numbers. They're great. There's always metrics. There's always a dashboard. There's always steps. And I think that y'all are onto something. And like just looking at how y'all answered that question, I think the why is like I think we're really missing that for people. Like we're not empathizing with how they're being affected. Franny, what would you say to that? Sort of seeing that now through that lens.
And so, in thinking through that, I would say another key piece of this is bring in your best people to help design what it's going to look like and why. So, examples might be anchor days. Maybe you have, I don't know, Tuesdays, and Tuesdays are strategy day. Everybody comes in. You're not allowed to have external meetings. You're not allowed to have Zoom meetings. You come in, you work on strategy together. I'm making this up, right? Fridays are the day where you get all your work done that's specific to your individual contributor role. But really setting up new structures for how to work together that is inclusive of the time component of work in a new way, and not expecting CEO to know. Like C-suite, they don't have any better idea than any of the rest of us. Putting your best and brightest on this so that they can come up with what is going to work for that organization. I would also really take a look at organizational structures. Are your teams too big? Are your teams too small? Are your teams not geographically co-located? Do they need to be geographically co-located? Really, truly? What are your norms around project management? What are your norms around how you're doing kickoff meetings? Is it a requirement that certain people be in the room for kickoff meetings? You have to make the implicit very explicit, and it cannot come from the people with the biggest office. It has to come from the people who are doing the work or managing the work.
You mean the people with the biggest office and the nanny and the stay-at-home spouse and the service that drives them everywhere? No, no, they
Right.
gotta be the one making that decision. And look, this is
Yeah.
where I know we're making like most
Yeah.
most most people who are in leadership positions do not mean to cause harm to the people that
Yeah,
work
they
for them.
don't.
We just all have our blind spots. We all have our
Right.
blind spots. And I think so I guess this
So
actually brings us to the next thing, talk about the needs. Like let's actually talk about employee needs in here, because I think one of the interesting questions that came up, and there's some data we're going to look at here about, you were talking about finding out from those people. I think sometimes, Franny, people are making assumptions about needs when they shouldn't, and they're not looking at data. And there's a chart we just popped up here for a second, because I think one of the notes in the comment said, oh, this is going to be a big setback for women. And is it that cut? I'm curious if it's really that cut and dry. And like, Karim, why don't you talk about this a little bit? Because this data came from your friend Kieran, which I also follow her, and she's like really, really fascinating person. She's founder of Textio and is a data what she calls her a data process nerd now. Like,
Yeah.
and this was really interesting to me because this definitely challenged an assumption I was making about on-site versus off-site.
Yeah. So for those who don't know Karen Snyder, her blog is called Nerd Processor. The backstory behind that is she was actually one of the people who helped develop the spell check for Microsoft Word, and has also developed a ton of different language-based AI businesses within large organizations like Microsoft and Amazon, but also a company called Textio, which does really cool stuff looking at the inclusiveness of performance reviews and job descriptions. So back in 2014, actually, Karen did a study prior to all of the kind of the whole hybrid remote return to office discussion, just looking at interruptions and in meetings, who gets interrupted and why. And she redid that work recently, looking at the kind of the degree of interruptions within remote meetings versus in-person meetings, and how what that says about, you know, some of the changes that have happened over the past couple of years in the ways that we work. So one of the conclusions is that actually, you know, there are downsides to remote work in terms of inclusion, at least as you look at it through the lens of who participates in meetings. So in general, the total number of participants has a negative relationship with the percentage of people who speak, right? So you have a meeting with 10 people, you're going to have a lower percentage that actually speak in that. But then what's really interesting is that remote work and to some degree the interruptions that are inherent to meetings in a remote environment seem to have a much larger impact on women's participation rates in different settings. So, you know, Mary Ellen alluded to kind of an assumption that I think a lot of us make, which is that remote work is by sort of default more inclusive for women, especially working mothers who may be juggling lots of different responsibilities. And one of the interesting kind of insights that this data points to is that it actually may not be as inclusive in terms of the way that women participate in different meeting settings.
Mm-hmm. What did you think when you saw this, Franny? I know we introduced you to this in the conversation about this. I mean, I'm still just like, this had me questioning all kinds of things. I mean, Kieran, this is what Kieran does. So,
So I would tell you that so much of this is about perception. And if the other 8 people in that room are men, they will not recognize this because they are perceiving that everyone's participating equally in many cases. I don't know that that's the case, but in my experience, you know, women are often told that we interrupt more than men do, when in fact we interrupt significantly less. There's a lot that goes on around the human dynamic in Zoom meetings that hasn't been fully examined or measured. So I appreciate that this is beginning to be measured. That we still bring our biases and we still bring our tendency to dehumanize one another to work when we're on a Zoom or when we are face-to-face. It's harder to do face-to-face. And people can pay closer attention to the micro expressions and the room dynamics if you are face-to-face. So women might interrupt for one another and say, I think that Mary Ellen said, whatever it may be. And they may feel more free to do that or feel more psychologically safe to do that face-to-face with established relationships than they may virtually or in a remote setting. I would say no truth is the objective truth. We all objectify one another, even and perhaps even more so when we don't have that chance to connect.
Yeah. One of the other interesting things I know we've got plenty of other things to talk about, but I would invite everyone to dive into Karen's research. The other interesting thing is that women, as you said very rightly, Franny, do get interrupted more than men in meetings based on her research. But the other interesting thing is actually they get interrupted by women more than they get interrupted by men. Which is a very fascinating data point that is there's lots to unpack there that we probably won't have time for today.
Well, Corinne, that's because the women were listening to what they were saying so they could interrupt them, and the dudes weren't even listening. No, that's not really that's it. But I do think, I think there's just something, the point I guess sort of saying this one, again, go follow Karen on LinkedIn, like actually just in general, like because
Yeah.
she's just like drops these kinds of like things all the time. Sort of, and this one I thought was just so counterintuitive that it doesn't mean, okay, I shouldn't use this argument about with women, you know, and bring it back because it's more inclusive. I think it, what to me, this is a signal that we should not make assumptions,
Yeah.
right? And so we talk about diverse needs. And I think some of this, Franny, you touched on a little bit, we talk about process, but like, how do you balance these needs? Like, so we have people who want to come back in. We have people who never want to go inside an office. We have people who like hybrid. How do we balance the needs of all these competing preferences?
Well, I think it starts, and both you and Franny kind of made this point, but I'll emphasize it. It's an employee base, an organization is not monolithic in its preferences, right? And so the preference of the CEO and the viewpoint of the CEO and the blind spots of the CEO are very different. Speaking as a CEO to other members of the team, and just understanding some of that nuance and doing some of that kind of deep dive, if you want to call it segmentation or kind of analysis of the team, is a really important step. You know, we work with a large financial services organization that was already really ahead of the curve, honestly, in terms of flexible working prior to the pandemic, and have been, you know, kind of doing a lot since the pandemic to really try and push to an even greater degree of flexibility. And one of the things that they do is they use the HBDI, which is our thinking preferences assessment, just to try and understand and get a glimpse of what different preferences might be for different employees in terms of aspects of flexibility that may be driving them to want to be remote or want to be in the office. You know, and again, just to use the whole brain model to explain some of this and give an example, right? There's probably an assumption for those of you that are familiar with the whole brain model that people with a high C quadrant kind of red relational preference are going to want to be back in the office. And that is, you know, that is true in some cases. And the correlated assumption is that the folks with the A quadrant analytical preference are more likely to want to be remote. Sure, but as Mary Ellen said, you know, there are obvious and significant sort of deviations from that, where, you know, that A quadrant person may be longing to go back into the office because it's where they can actually get the focus that they need to do the kind of deep analysis that may have been incredibly challenging for them to do working from home, right? And so each individual has different needs, and understanding that through the lens of their thinking preference is really important. I mean, look, navigating hybrid work is kind of like catering a banquet, right? Where everyone's got a different favorite dish, you got all the different food allergies and everything else, right? Understanding all those preferences, you know, the ways that people are thinking about the return to office, that's the recipe for success.
No, you get unseasoned chicken, and that's that. Here it is. Here's your unseasoned chicken and your Caesar salad. Enjoy. You know, so Franny, how do we, from the HR leader perspective, how do we learn this about people? Like, what are tactically, like, how do we get a handle on like what people actually need, and then how do we work this out? Because you're going to do the big survey, right? I mean, if we're a good sized organization, we're really fundamentally talking about big. You're going to do the survey, and the stuff's going to come back. What do you do?
So I would
Tell me
actually
the
start
how.
with, I think this is a little bit easier in more mature organizations with, and I know it doesn't seem like it would be, but in organizations where it's clear how to measure people's work. So starting from the premise of we don't actually know if everyone is more productive or less productive in the office or at home. We just don't know,
And
right?
ever, we actually don't know how productive people are at all.
Period.
Like, let's just go
Yeah.
ahead and answer that. Like, and from a, we
Mhm.
don't actually collect that data. Like,
Yeah.
so,
So I would start with that perhaps we design the jobs, redesign jobs, and get clarity about, um, what does productive look like within these different roles? And are we sure that that's what it really needs to look like given AI? So really taking a look at what is the purpose of each of these jobs, and how are we going to, if this person knocked it out of the park, what would that look like in a year? What would that look like in 6 months? What would that look like in 3 months? And really clarify the purpose of the roles that we have within our organization and how we're going to measure those. Second thing I would do is then decide together with those folks individually and within your departments and teams, what do you need to be successful in this role in the short term and in the long term, given that these are the metrics that we're going to be measuring you by. Some of that may be working face to face. Some of that may be working in the office, and there is a distinction to be made there. So like Karim will go out and talk to people face to face. He doesn't expect everybody to come to him, right? So there's that. What do you need to be successful in this role with these metrics? And then if some of that is working in the office or working collaboratively, getting to clarity from there. Does that mean a project kickoff? Does that mean that we get together once a week, twice a week in the office? What does that actually mean? With the assumption that, of course, people are going to want to work from home, but they may not be successful if they isolate too much or if they don't develop the relationships required to get the job done. They may be able to tell you that they can develop those relationships online, in which case I would say, great, let's see you do it. This takes it's a much more customized approach, but between return to office and AI, I think you have to take a much more customized and heavy refresh approach to what the jobs are. And I think you should ideally, as a leader, do that proactively. And if you're an employee, you should assume that it's being done proactively or that you should help with that to be done proactively so that you can find how you can collaborate with others on how you are going to add value in this new work environment. I don't know if that answers your question directly, but I would say you got to start well outside of make sure my Diet Cokes are stocked in the break room. Like you really have to start with what is the purpose of the work? How do we measure the purpose of the work? And then what's required to help people be successful in that work?
That is, I mean, that is hard work. I mean, it's interesting. That is hard enough when you're looking at a company with like 20, 30, 40, 50 people. When you start
Mhm.
thinking about doing that at the level of like, I've got 10,000 employees, I've got 5,000 employees, I do not envy like the chief people officers of the large global enterprises right now. I mean, they've had a rough
Mhm.
ride for the last few years. Like I
Mhm.
think I think the upside is that we've actually thinking about talent. We're thinking about some of these things that like CHROs have been raising a flag about for a long time. So I think they got attention for that. But I think these are real deep fundamental things. Kareem, what would you do? Like how do you account for this? Like how do you actually get in there and figure out what people need when you have a big organization like that?
Well, I mean, I think even in a large scale organization, some of the best CEOs that I know and work with are actively talking to, you know, talent across the board all the time, right? And so,
Mhm.
there are lots of different ways of doing that. Employee listening, and there's a whole slew of software kind of platforms that enable you to do that. But frankly, you know, the good CEOs that I work with, the best CEOs that I work with, are finding every opportunity to just engage with people and talk to them and asking them the real questions about, okay, like, are you coming back into the office? Why or why not? Right? What's getting in the way of your productivity? I try and do that. Franny mentioned it because we chatted about it the other day. Like I try and talk to as many of my team, and actually, as a fully remote company, go and visit with team members as often as the opportunity allows. But there's lots of different ways to get your ear to the ground, and fundamentally, it just comes back to getting your ear to the ground as a leader, so that you are aware of something beyond your own existence, your own sort of biases, right? Or perhaps the biases and preferences of those people that are immediately surrounding you, who probably also have the nannies and the ability to kind of make the most of flexible work, right? Um, so that's I think that's step one, and every leader should be talking to talent. Step two, in my mind, is really getting some data, and this is where my kind of own personal analytical preference comes in. Get the data about what people prefer. Ask them in a sort of a scalable way. How does this how does this policy work for you, right? And use things like the HPDI to help interpret that data, right? You can get to some of the answers on why, not just by asking, but also by looking at the data through the lens of, okay, for this particular part of the organization, for this particular individual employee, these are some of the explanatory factors, right? They have a preference for this in terms of the way that they think. Their job requires this, their personal circumstances might require that. There are ways of getting that data and using it to inform it. And again, I see companies doing this day in, day out. And it's a partnership between the CEO, the CHRO, and really managers across the organization to be able to get that insight and to continue to use it to inform how do we structure our work policies, our hybrid or remote policies at scale, but in as personalized a fashion as possible, right? Because I think you're right, Fanny. The degree of personalization that's expected now, right, by talent is very high, and that's true whether you're in an enormous organization or you're in a tiny organization.
Yep.
And I don't know that it needs to be customized by person all the time. It can be customized by job type, right? So there are many, many jobs that must be done in person, period.
Right.
I would say starting from there, starting with the people who actually work with the customer, whoever that may be, would probably be the best place to start, is literally building this structure of accountability from the customer first and working backwards. It doesn't necessarily have to be customized to the employee, but it should be certainly rethought by job at this point. And thank goodness, because that means they need HR people. So
we got a poll. Let's pop up a poll on this. I want to see, like, we actually kind of just find out, what do you think? Leaders, what do you need from your leadership right now when it comes to remote work? Like, I'd like to see your answers to that, even especially coupled with the other one. So Grace, if you can share that one with everybody. So what should their priority be? What do you wish your C-suite was doing as you're all coming back? Is it about like the what? Is it about like, give me my objectives? How are we going to measure this? You keep telling me to come. Is it about being clear and giving clear guidelines, expectations? Is it about, I really need the support. Let's address these concerns better. Is it about thinking more, you need people to get encouraged to think more creatively? Like, what do you think is needed? I'm very curious to see this one compared to the other one too, in particular, what we said the challenges were. I want to see what they say, because they might not necessarily line up. So this is hard work. I think we really underestimated how hard it was going to be. I just kept, sometimes I see these plans and I see the way it backfires, and I'm like, wow, was there a pre-mortem ever conducted in this? Like, who did you talk to? Like, when you came up with this plan, it just feels very, it did not feel thoughtful to me. No, not feel thoughtful to me. All right, let's see our numbers. Oh, look, it's also the yellow again. The yellow again. And you know what I also think is ironic? I wonder, Karim, is there a common profile type for people who in the CEO? Is it pretty even? Is there a split? Like, where do you think most C-suite people, what do they
Yeah,
tend to have a dominant?
it varies a little bit industry to industry. We do
Mm-hmm.
see significantly more people with balanced profiles. So, in terms of the percentage, there's a much higher percentage, statistically significant percentage of CEOs that have a balanced profile on the HBDI than in other roles. A big piece of that is because the CEO role is so varied in its demands or in its nature. But overarching, we do see a bit of a tilt to the blue and the yellow, right? And that definitely factors in. Again, my own preferences are geared that way. And you have to. Part of why this is so hard is because, again, you're looking at it through the lens of your own personal needs, your own personal preferences, and you have to admit your own biases and potential blind spots. You have to admit to yourself that you could be wrong or you could be missing something, right? And that self-awareness as a leader is a really important component. You understand yourself first, and then you can start to understand your people and your culture, and that allows you to get the buy-in, right? That is such a challenge right now. we haven't gained buy-in from our different employees, different groups of employees, different types of thinkers within our organizations, to make this return to office fantasy a reality, right? If that is indeed what a CEO is trying to accomplish.
It's funny because I looked at that, and that one of the sort of things that jumped out at me in that gap is I think that a lot of return to office plans are made by blue-green people for blue-green people, right? There's a lot of emphasis on the steps and the task and check in this day, and you need to be back by this day, and like, and this because of this. And all I can think is like, we're failing at this repeatedly because we keep trying to bring facts to a feelings party. Right. This is
Mhm.
a feelings and ideas party. You have not sold me on the big idea, and you have not
Mhm.
made me feel like you care about me. Like, you haven't, we have forgotten the bottom. It's the yellow and the red. Like, I think
In some
that's the
cases,
whole, I
that's
see.
not universally true, though. It is in
No, no,
other
no. Right. But
cases.
I'm just looking at those
In
polls.
other
Like,
cases, you can think about it in terms of the cerebral versus kind of limbic
mm-hmm,
divergence, right? And so it all makes sense in theory, right? It all makes sense in
right.
terms of like the big idea and the numbers. Oh, of course, like we've just plunked down $2 billion on this massive, beautiful office tower. Of course, that makes sense, right? But then you start thinking about the practical and personal elements of that, and again, you haven't thought through that, and you haven't gotten the buy-in on it, which makes it so challenging. So, they're actually, I've seen a surprising diversity of reasons why it's not working, right? But understanding it and making sure you've got kind of a holistic approach to solving the problem, to addressing that as an organization, but even on your team, frankly, in the team dynamics, it's almost more pronounced, right? And definitely something that's easier to affect, right? Because you're not talking about typically thousands of people or even hundreds of people. You're talking about a handful, maybe a dozen people, and it's a lot more realistic to be able to take those preferences into account and try and create strategies to make team work at that level.
Marilyn,
Sorry.
you're
My mute
there you
thing.
go.
Okay, so there's a comment in here that I thought was kind of funny where I think Michael Davis said that's an easy choice. Leadership is rooted in the D quadrant. And I was like, well, that's something a D quadrant person would say.
I too read a little bias into
Um,
that one. I
yeah,
mean,
right. Like, yeah, because I mean, as a high D quadrant, I'll take that. I'll take that. Like,
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, leadership
um,
comes from every part of the brain, and frankly,
yeah.
to be an effective leader, you have to be able to lead people who have very different preference from you. Leadership is about galvanizing any type of thinker to kind of align around what the goal is.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting. I do think it's an interesting way to think about your biases, think about what you might be missing. To me, it's a mechanism to remind you to take into account things that aren't natural or as easy for you. So that's
Yeah.
um, let's go through it. I want to talk a little bit about how do we actually get into this as teams, because I think some of this we've talked a lot about this personalization, and we talk about individual needs and these preferences, but we don't work alone. Like modern work, like in the kind of organizations we're talking about, or this is a team sport. We're in teams. So what do leaders need to do to rebuild trust and like get these collaborations? We get people back. Let's say they're moving forward, they want to do this. Like, what should leaders be doing to get the teams together?
For me, it's trust. Um, One of the things that I've seen in this rapidly changing way of working post-pandemic and the impact that it's had on team dynamics is that it's really accelerated the reality of Velcro teaming, right? Teams that come apart and come back together and reconfigure all the time, right? And so often in those kind of endless variations of teams, trust is what's lacking in terms of that team being able to really achieve its goals. And that's not surprising because, frankly, in this environment, in a hybrid environment, in a return to office environment, team dynamics are like putting together a puzzle with pieces that keep changing shape, right? And so trust is the glue, if you want to call it that helps keep it all from falling apart when maybe that one piece doesn't fit squarely with the other one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I've always thought I was trying to see if I could remember who originally said this, the idea that it should be a crime to break up a high performing team. So when we talk about Velcroing and we talk about this, I know that's the idea is that we're all supposed to be able to quickly show up and get people to trust you. And I had the opportunity actually earlier this year to interview Drew Brees.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I asked him about was like, how do you really quickly get people to trust you? Like if you imagine showing up in a locker room the first day, it's a new team, new people. Every year, the new football season, it's always a new person. And I think we talked about to Bronco Mendenhall about this as well. Every year, Bronco Mendenhall came back and he had a whole new group of people. Every game, you pay practice and always had a new team. And if you break up a team, like when you rebuild a team and forming, that's a really challenging leadership skill. It's actually really hard to do that over and over. Most of us can't do that like that, you know, like that's
Yeah,
really hard. So why do I mean, Franny, what do you see when leaders who have done this, and from your observation, the leaders who've done this well, you know, because you've sat in these situations where people acquired, like you've got things, these people got to figure out how to get along fast. We know that most mergers and acquisitions do not realize the value, the projected value,
right.
nowhere near. And I think
Yeah, and
this is partly why. So
I
talk to
would
me about
say
this. How do you get that trust fast?
Kareem is right. It comes down to trust, and it comes down to, I think, to get trust, you got to give trust. And I think you absolutely have to extend goodwill, extend your trust, and extend the ability um, for people to make the decisions that are in their best interest, and then give them the full context. So be as transparent as possible about everything they need to know in order to be successful in this new world of working. I would also say um, there are many of these skills that we just don't have yet. So, Mary Ellen, to your point, there and to the point of many of the people in the webinar who've chatted about this, there's new skills that we have to teach people how to use. So, teaching people about team building, teaching people about working in the virtual working world, teaching people about working in the office, really making the implicit explicit as much as possible, setting people up to win, and again, extending trust. That is a very good start.
So let's pop up. We have the last poll here, and I know we are just about at time. I'd love to see what you think your teams need. Think about this one through the lens of your team. What does your team need the most to improve as they're coming back? Is it access to data? Is it about better workflows and creating efficiencies? Is it about opportunities to get together on that personal level? Like what's missing? What do you feel like your team needs the most? Not just you. What's the team need? Come on, I want to see this data.
Yeah, unfortunately, panelists can't vote because I'm like itching to.
I know, I know. I have like, I know what I want to say. I know what I want to say, but like, and it's not the same as what I need. That's one thing I would definitely say is what I think my team needs. We're a fully, actually, this isn't true anymore. My story is kind of interesting on this. Like I worked remotely and hybrid for my entire career. Journalist is inherently hybrid and remote. And we're always bouncing around. Like I got lectured early on in my first job, out of school. Like if I was at my desk, I was like, hi, why are you at your desk? There are no stories here. Are there any stories at your desk? I don't see any stories at your desk. So that's always how I was trained to work. And I wound up working that way for a long time. And during the pandemic, I got so sick of it. I actually bought a building and like renovated it. And now I have an office and it has a studio in it because I needed to desperately to leave my house. And I've got a couple of team members, the local ones come in 2 or 3 days a week, but most people are. So I think this is crazy for all of us. All right. So we got a different set of responses here. What do they need? Oh, it actually is the highest one is opportunities for people to connect,
Mhm.
right? It's opportunities for people to connect. And then we also still see the innovative, we still see the list. Like data, nobody's begging for data. I'd love to know the HPDI profiles of the people who attended this webinar. Do red people attend more webinars than so, but what is your reaction when you see this, Kareem? Because I know you think about teams a lot right now in terms of how we're using the whole brain thinking and the HPDI around teams. But what do you see here in this set of responses?
Well, I mean, I think the reality is, yeah, every team needs all of these at different points in their team life cycle, right? So one of the ways of thinking about this and interpreting this is kind of where is your team right now, And why is it that they might need an opportunity to connect on a personal level, or an innovative tool to enhance collaboration, or some sort of a streamlining of their workflows? Because again, to be an effective team, you really need, again, through the whole brain lens, you need to be effective in having the data and analytics that you need. You need to be able to really continually optimize your processes. You need to create lots of trust and lots of opportunities for team members to build or rebuild that trust, right? To, if you think about sort of team dynamics, like rekindling an old flame, trust and collaboration are those sparks that make it burn bright again. So,
Mhm.
you always need those. And there's always going to be opportunities for new tools and technologies. I mean, that's a big focus for us at Herrmann right now, is creating some of those innovative tools and technologies that help you take the aha moment that the HBDI provides and really apply it to ongoing benefits in terms of team effectiveness, right? So when I look at this, I say, okay, we've got a lot of folks on our webinar who are hungry for some kind of more personal trust building moments with their teams. But the reality is, all of those are going to be important to each one of their teams, I would expect,
Mhm.
at some point in the near future.
I would
Yeah.
like to take a couple of minutes if y'all can stick around for just a few minutes. Just like if we got any questions. We had a great chat going over here. Like I love it. They actually were having a great discussion back and forth. I know we were all monitoring that and talking about, people with intent and through the lens of whole brain thinking. There was also some concerns about double dipping. And it's interesting because I think that comes back to the trust. I think something has happened here where it's like we don't necessarily trust that people are showing up in the way that they should be. And I guess, Franny, I think you and I have talked about some of this, like needing to know what people are doing all day. Is that a good reason, right? Can you actually prevent the double dipping? Like, should that be a motivating factor in bringing people back to the office, Franny?
No, I mean, depending upon the maturity level of the C-suite, I would not recommend it. I would instead recommend that we get really, again, make the implicit explicit, make it really, really clear what it looks like for somebody to win in that job. What are the measurable outcomes associated with that role? Are they meeting or exceeding the measurable outcomes associated with that role? Are they developing themselves and others? Are they following the behaviors associated with our key values, our mission, vision, and values? And then lastly, are they breaking any non-disclosure agreement that we may have or non-compete agreement that we may have with anything else they may be doing on their own time? That would be where I would focus my time, energy, and efforts, is being a trustworthy employer more so than worrying whether or not I can trust my employees. Really make it clear how to win in my organization and then hold people accountable for that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm so philosophically aligned with that, Freddie, because I think, if you have someone double dipping, it means that their job is not designed the right way, frankly, right? And some aspect of that design is off, whether it's comp or whether it's the expectations and the clarity about what they're there to achieve, right? So, looking at that and saying, okay, if we have that issue, if we have that risk, and frankly, if they're doing what they need to do, then and then what you're paying them to do and everything else, I think that's the reality of
And they're
sort
adding
of the
value, then
yeah, exactly. The gigification, if you want to call that, of the labor market at this point, is that there are going to be people who are going to be working multiple jobs for any number of reasons. Some of it may be financial. Some of it may be, rooted in a need for balance, right? Someone who sits in front of a computer for 4 days a week may need a day a week to go and practice massage therapy because it's sort of the antidote to a life inundated by screen. So, there are lots of reasons to drive that. What's most important I think from the employer standpoint, is making sure that you've designed the job and you design the role in such a way where it's really clear if you're getting what you need or if not,
I think,
and that the
just in
employee
this
is
case,
doing the
people are
same.
talking about people using, going and doing other jobs. And like, I think if it doesn't show up, you should be looking at the performance. I mean, if like, are they nailing it, right? And then that comes back. If they are, you start to ask questions about, but ask yourself questions, we all just like say results oriented and it's outcome oriented. And first of all, I actually don't believe that is ever rarely true, even for people who say it. I think fundamentally what we think when we get employees versus outsourcing a task, right? If you can really do that, you should know that your job is in danger. Like if you can actually pull that off and work in two different places, like, and not like, and that's why you want to work remotely. It's like, you should know that your job is expendable. Like you could definitely be outsourced if that is that easy for you to do that.
Yeah.
I think what we really want is people's attention.
Mhm.
Like when I hire somebody, when I have some people that are actually on my staff, W-2 employees, I'm not buying outcomes. I'm buying their attention to the problems that we need to solve together.
Mhm.
And can we give that attention remotely? Absolutely. Can we give it in person? Sure. Like but you do have to learn this. Like, I think we have to relearn how to work together in person.
Mhm.
Like, that's a weird thing. We assume we know how to do that. No, we don't. We have huge swaths of the workforce who've actually never done that now. We have a whole generation. We have a whole generation of young adults right now in corporate America who have not set foot in an office.
Mhm.
Of course, they'd be scared of it. We have a bunch of other young adults, experienced adults who haven't, they might have done it before, but they haven't been doing it for years. And you just told them, like, they got to rework their lives. Like, they have to So I guess it was a parting words here. I guess I'll go to you, Franny. Like last sort of bits of advice. If you're you're a business leader, you're CHR, and you're listening to this, and you're trying to figure out, okay, my boss, we want to do this, but it's not working. Like, what's your advice?
Be human. Do what you ask other people to do. Set the example,
Hmm.
and listen carefully to what folks have to say. Be human. Extend the humanity to others.
Hmm. Yeah, like
Great
leaders
advice.
go first. Like
Yeah,
leaders go first, y'all. Like you cannot tell these people to come back to the office that you don't go to.
that's right.
Like
Oh
I don't
God,
think
no,
that works.
no, no. Mm-mm. Mm-mm. Yeah,
Kareem,
and
what's
keep
your
learning.
parting advice?
Well, there's that saying about not working harder, working smarter. And I think move the hybrid world and productivity in a hybrid world is all about finding that sweet spot where energy meets efficiency. So one of the big things that I spent a lot of time talking to leaders about and teams about, frankly, is energy management and how, just like charging your phone, you've got to plug into the right tasks at the right time to stay fully powered.
Oh my God, yeah. We jokingly call that, like, I'll say I got to do some blue work today because like my preferences are yellow and red, and there's some blue in there. My green is like this. It's like,
Yep.
so I always say it's like I got to go get to do green work. It's like, huh, time. I got to get some coffee.
Yep.
I'll be over here. Oh, look, there's a new, St. Vincent album. All right, I'll be like that's it. There's a whole set of conditions, and I think if we start to match that, that is the kind of work that is well suited to being done at home for
Mhm.
some people,
Mhm.
but not everybody.
Mhm.
Other
Yeah.
times we need to collaborate and we want to ideate together. Sometimes we want to ideate apart. I think even
Mhm.
thinking about our own assumptions about like, okay, brainstorming, like, and like, what does
Yeah.
that mean? Like, that word doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. Collaboration doesn't mean the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Magic moments can be in person. They can also be individual, and understanding that and understanding how to channel your energy towards what needs to be done, and knowing what motivates you, what gives you energy and what depletes your energy, is an essential bit of awareness these days.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Well, thank you both so much for taking the time to do this. This was a great conversation for me, and I love it because even as a moderator who sat down and planned this, and I know both of you quite well and your perspective on things, I learned things in this conversation, and it gave me some great ideas for how I think about this, even with my own team. And I think everybody else that joined too, they are lively over here. This is a lively chat. So, folks asked if like they would be able to get this on demand. Absolutely. So we will be sending it around. You'll get an email, have some follow up. We will also include some of our tools, some of the whole brain things that you can use, like even to help with this in terms of with teams. Um, Franny, how can people find you to connect after?
I'm on the LinkedIn, Franny Oxford. Just look for me.
All right. And Kareem, best way to find you.
LinkedIn works. Yeah.
All
It's
right. Cool.
LinkedIn/NEHDI, my surname.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you all so much. And everybody have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.